So I understand that you did talk about graphic organizers a little bit before. Just out of curiosity, how many of you feel like you have a decent mastery of it? And I'm going to ask you to do is to demonstrate that for me by taking your thumb and just going like this if you feel that you know more or less what graphic organizers are. If you don't, please just indicate like this. And it's okay. I just want to get a feel in the room beforehand. Okay, and it's okay to put your hand this way if you think you know a little bit. If you put your thumb up, I may actually ask you to say something about it. So I don't want to scare anybody here. By the way, did anyone realize what I just did in the process? Would anyone like to comment on that for a second? Yes? Okay, organize your thoughts. Great. What else? Yes?
You know, everybody in the class, you know what everybody in the class knows.
I surveyed the room with just a moment. What do we normally do in a classroom? What am I doing right now? I put a question out there, right? And if everybody's focused, which you might be because it's the first 5 minutes, I haven't put you to sleep yet, okay? But in the first few minutes, maybe you have everybody's rapt attention. So you've got everybody focused, you put the question out there. The best you could typically do is get one person to respond while getting everybody else to at least think about it. That's the best case scenario. Does that sound right? Okay? And I might wait 7 seconds, which is hard to imagine waiting 7 seconds, because that really means that you have control of yourself and your class. You can give it that much time. But that is what research says is the best approach in terms of wait time. Wait time means you're giving their minds a processing opportunity. Keep in mind, you are at a distinct advantage every time you get up in a classroom because you're older, you're more sophisticated, and you've mastered your content. At least we hope so. And you've prepared. So you're walking in with all of these advantages. Your students have to listen to you, and they have to get it within a relatively quick time frame. So at least give them a fighting chance by giving them some wait time to think about the question. And I also strongly encourage you, if you are going to survey the room and then choose one student, put the name on the back end. So what is Rashi's opinion again about the word vayihi? Shloimi. Because if you say Shloimi, what is Rashi's opinion about the word vayihi? What have you just done? You just put everybody else to sleep. Or you told them that this question is not relevant to them, which is of course not what you want. Not really our topic, but certainly worthwhile. So, as we talk about graphic organizers, I'm curious to know if anybody here, I did see, by the way, a few thumbs up. Most of you were either being modest or really would like a little refresher, which is fine. But that's good information for me to know. It's easy, it's also non-threatening. The other point that wasn't mentioned is that by asking you to put your thumbs over here, and you can do it with numbers too. So for example, if you want to say, let's say you're teaching a three-way machlokas, Rashi, Rambam, and Rabbeinu Yonah about the Asara Nisyonos. You might be familiar that there are different opinions about what the 10 tests were, and you can find it in Pirkei Avos. So you say, the Rishon who holds that the Kivshana Eish of Nimrod was one of the 10 tests, please put a 1 if it's Rashi, a 2 if it's Rambam, a 3 if it's Rabbeinu Yonah. I'm not sure if 2 or 1, I know Rambam doesn't include it because it's not written in the Torah, that much I do remember. I'm not sure about Rabbeinu Yonah. Okay, but let's just say it's Rashi only for argument's sake. Okay? Then by surveying the room quickly, you all put a 1 over here if you got it right, and if not, I can see that you didn't. Even if some are guessing, I get a pretty good feel. Did you get what I taught? Okay? Keep in mind, both Rabbi Gottlieb and I are in doctoral programs, and one of the things you learn about in research is Pearson's correlation, which is that you have to see, is there a correlation between, let's say, a certain variable and the impact, so to speak, that that variable might have. So one of the things that I tell teachers all the time is that we think that there's a perfect 1. Positive 1 is the perfect correlation. That means it follows exactly so, that the impact is direct and complete. Negative 1 is a complete inverse correlation. And then usually things plot somewhere in between. So we typically think as teachers that there's a perfect correlation between teaching and learning, which means that I said it, so of course you got it. Everybody with me on that? As if I had this computer cable, and I'm going to pour it from my mouth into your brain. Okay, nowadays with Wi-Fi, I can just do it, wireless, even better. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and say what I have to say. You're automatically going to process it because I said it, and who's a greater orator than I, other than the other distinguished people in the room? Okay, so I assume that you mastered it because I got it. I said it and I got it. Okay? But we have to remember our students may or may not learn it just because we taught it. So keeping in mind that the correlation between teaching and learning is oftentimes far less than 1, then we have to be checking on a regular basis for the purpose of measuring, was the learning actually accomplished? And we often have this tendency, I'm jumping on a little bit, but not too much, I'm going to get back to where I really wanted to go. We often have a tendency to feel this pressure, and you're going to feel it too, because you'll have a principal that you report to, this idea of moving, right? This notion of covering ground, of fulfilling your curricular expectations, and you have to do that. But at the same time, you have to remember that it doesn't do you or your talmidim any good if you've just, gone a mile long, but only an inch thick or maybe even less. You have to weigh that, and you have to see what am I doing and what's working, what's not working. And did everybody get it? Did some of them get it? Okay. Anyone on the graphic organized? Would anyone like? Were there any comments or questions on what I've said? Anything that either, and it could be just affirming, like it resonates with you, something you want to build on? Okay. Yes.
You were in the middle of mentioning about why you placed it on the chest.
Oh, I didn't finish. Thank you for mentioning that. So I did that because I wanted everyone to be able, first of all, to feel safe in responding. By the way, I tend to lose track of my thoughts after 7 p.m. I didn't tell her I got like this, but okay. So number one, it's a safe thing because even if you got it wrong, nobody else knows but you. Number one. Number two, I don't know if you've ever had this experience. I had it in 6th grade, where we had a room actually set up somewhat similar to this, and we just didn't have this, table in the front here. It was sort of like a U, and the Rebbe asked a question, and boy A responded, boy B responded, boy C responded, and then boy D, who happened to be, one of the smarter boys in the class, responded in another way, and all of a sudden, magically, E, F, G, H, and I all follow D. And then the next smart boy responded maybe differently, and it sort of carried its way around the room. And it reminded me of the power of influence that we have on one another. And so if I ask you to put your answer here, and everybody can see it, the kids who are indecisive or are not sure or weren't paying attention, they're just going to look at the answer that's put up there by the people that they trust. And so you're not seeing what they really know. So by putting it over here, A, it's safe, and B, it's an honest assessment. At least it might still be a guess, but at least I know you're not looking around the room. Did that answer your question? Well, normally if they're in rows, or even in a semicircle, look, you can watch them do their thing, right? You're surveying the room too, and you have a good presence, you have a good feel. What do they actually know? So you're looking around, the kids whose eyes are darting from one to the next, you got it, you picked it up. Right? So you call him over afterwards, whatever you do, in order to figure out what he really knows. But most of your talmidim actually give you an honest answer, at least try to. Okay, was that responsive? Okay. Anyone on graphic organizers? Yes?
The visual aid to help organize thoughts or any information.
Both sides work on this one? I think so. Okay. All right, so I heard visual aid, and I heard organize. Were those the 2 main points, or was there something else as well?
That was
okay.
pretty much
Okay. Which one should we focus on first? Which one would you like to?
Visual aid.
Visual aid. Okay, so tell me more about that, please.
Visual aid helps you, sometimes in it you have your thoughts all kind of all out there, and when you have it, when you see it, it kind of concretizes it.
So clarify for me then what organize means in your mind.
Well, a visual aid and organizer, visual aid is more of a way of helping you organize. So organize is more
really
general, and visual aid is more specifically like the tool to help you organize it.
So this leads to this?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm hearing then really that the main positive outcome is organization. Is that fair?
That's the positive outcome, yeah.
That's the best, okay, excellent. Anyone else? Yes?
It also advances thinking.
How so?
Once students are able to visualize everything that they do know on one level, they can take it to the next level.
Clarify what you mean, please. From one level, taking it to another level. I didn't get that fully.
Let's say, if, first of all, allows you to mesh the thinking of from various different students, so that students are building on each other's thinking. So having
If I do a
central
collective.
Right.
Okay.
But also, even a student may have the knowledge in his head, and it's not
Uh-huh.
necessarily coming through. It's not in his
He's not able to articulate it clearly?
Mind. Once he puts it into a chart, it's there in front of him.
Okay.
And to any sort of organizer. If it's
Okay.
in front of him, then he can move forward.
Okay, so it advances his thinking, but it also, I'm trying to think if this is the term that you might use if you knew it. Please forgive the terminology because it's not the most sophisticated, but it's actually something that they say you should do when taking a test. And perhaps a strategy you might just want a teacher tell me dim as well. We have, remind me, make sure that I come back to where I started with this. We have a difficult time holding on to information, especially if it's not well contextualized, if it doesn't really fit or we're not so clear about it. And so we sort of hold it in the frontal lobe of our brain, in our short-term memory. We never really got it where it needs to go to hold it for long-term retention. And so they suggest minimally to do what's called a brain or mind, I think mind dump, which means you just put information that you think you'll forget in the margin of the test at the very beginning. Because if I had it when the teacher said go, it's not cheating, right? So if I pull out the paper I had in my pocket, that's cheating. But if I put it on the paper at the beginning of the test, that's kosher. Okay, how that works, different conversation. But minimally, that's what it is. So it sounded to me almost like a mind dump, like I'm going to put down what I know and let it sort of plot a little bit. Is that what you meant, or did you mean something different? Just like expressing what you already have and sort of like using that as a springboard to go further. Okay. So I'm going to write what I know now. Maybe. I'm not sure exactly, but hopefully through our conversation, it'll become more clear. By the way, I don't think I included it here, and if I didn't, it's shame on me. Hold on. No, it's here. Good. Okay, it's here. Okay, yes?
No, in terms of advanced thinking, he just reminded me that it also, when you have certain graphic organizers that have the compare and contrast, like you have certain things, these two groups have similarities, you understand it much more when you see
Sure.
the differences and the similarities between the things
Sure.
instead of having it all in one.
Okay, so it's interesting. We keep going further into it. We haven't really defined what it is. So for those people who weren't sure, we need to go back and do that, I think. Is that reasonable? But thank you, that was an excellent point. Do you want to define it, or do you have a point?
I'm just making sure I'm understanding what those are charts.
So hold for a second. Let me try to define it, and then I'll come back to you if I wasn't clear. Graphic comes from the word picture. Okay, right? You see graphics, right? You hear the term. Sometimes you hear it in a negative term, like a picture is very graphic. It's sort of like conveys unpleasant pictures and whatnot. That's not really what it refers to. Organizer, it's pretty typical. Okay, so I'm using a visual to organize information. So for example, I'll just show you a picture of one, and there are many. Here's a picture of a graphic organizer. What goes where, you might know, you might not know, we'll talk about it, okay? But information will go in this visual, and the picture is there for a reason, the way that it looks. So it's an image, and it's an image designed to help you organize information in a more clear fashion. What do you see as, in addition to what's here, is there anything else that you see as a benefit of why I would use a graphic organizer? I'm not yet talking about when, although that might come up in our conversation. Does anyone see a benefit in doing it in general? Yes?
In general, we've spoken before about certain learners that are visually inclined.
So you did talk about it. Maybe you didn't even realize. Okay, because I asked her about Gottlieb if you talked about modalities or
I heard that,
intelligences.
but I just got to film on the
Are you familiar with Howard Gardner? Howard Gardner is a professor in Harvard. And already back in the early 80s, he popularized a theory which actually you can find in Chazal. If you look at the Mefarshim, on the Pasuk Hanoch Lunar Al Pidarko, if you look at the Ralbag and then Malbim, you'll see very clearly that they talk about different learners, different inclinations, different interests. And so the notion of Al Pidarko might be in terms of what excites me, that's a piece of it, but it's also about making the information work for me. One of the things that I sometimes talk or write about is the fact that we in the world of chinuch today, I think, have a unique challenge. Forgetting the 21st century and technology and some of those challenges that we deal with. But as a system, right, we're in a place in history that is pretty much unprecedented. With the possible exception, I say possible because I really don't think it was exactly the same type of system at all, of what we find in the Gemara by Rabbi Shimon ben Gamla in Bayeshen. You might be familiar. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamla was the Kohen Gadol living at the time of Shimon ben Shetach, and he instituted, together with Shimon ben Shetach, a chinuch system in Eretz Yisrael. But that was typically for older students and had a different approach entirely. We're asking our children today to go through an entire, 20-year educational odyssey. And it's boys, it's girls, it's from preschool all the way through kollel and perhaps beyond. And we are asking ourselves and our communities to educate kimat everybody. So maybe 150 years ago in Europe, you'd have the core chinuch process, or maybe they would learn Chumash and some Tehillim or whatever it was, maybe Mishnayos, and there would be sort of a self-selecting process for most of them, either because intellectually or financially or both, they weren't able to manage the rigors and they would move on to some type of trade and that type of thing. But for most of Klal Yisrael, what we have today is sort of unique. And we need to understand that putting 20 some odd Talmidim in a room and expecting to instruct them all in the same way is fundamentally unfair. It's fundamentally unfair. We do it, and we have to talk maybe a little bit, I don't know how much we'll get into differentiation and whatever, but we need to realize that everybody in this room right here is wired differently. You have different abilities. You have different knowledge that you bring into our conversation. And right now, I'm giving you all the same type of instruction, which is auditory. Okay? So you've been in yeshiva for a while, you're more mature learners, maybe you can handle it okay. But what I would really be doing you a service is if I would give you instruction in a way that you could best utilize it, right, based on your own capabilities. And that would include the visual piece, whether using the board, using your whatever text you might have, other things. There's visual verbal, right? Visual verbal means you see words and you do well with words. There's visual nonverbal, where you do well with charts. But charts are also good in the area of spatial, of logical, mathematical logical. You see things in a progressive form. And your mind is able to capture that imagery and capture those words in a much easier way because, as we all know, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So even though I'm writing words on the paper, when I see it laid out the way that I do, it creates meaning for me right away. And it's a lot easier than if I just had a list on a piece of paper. Are you following the basic idea? By the way, if you do that in a classroom and the kids go like this, it's told you nothing. Okay? Because they will do this even if they are totally out to lunch. So that's where checking for understanding really is helpful. Okay? So a graphic organizer, to answer your question, tell me if I did answer it, is an image. It's a picture that helps you, but not just a picture as in any old picture. It's a framework, usually a table or a chart, that allows you to plot information, and that gives you some kind of sense of where things belong. What else can I clarify?
Just going to what you did on the board.
Yes.
The arrow going from visually to organized in one place. That would be a.
It wasn't because that was my answer per se.
It wasn't. I'm saying
but it was what I think our friend was looking to.
You use it as one of your graphic organizers.
Certainly, it serves the purpose of organizing, which is very important. And to your point, I think it was, I'm not sure, my Rebbe, a 9th grade Rebbe, Huda Oldbaum, who used to be the Manal and the 9th grade Rebbe of Breuer's before he started a girls' high school in Borough Park. He used to say, which is not only his expression, if you can't say it, you don't know it. That was his way of expressing that if you can't articulate what you want to say, then something in here is not quite right. Right? You don't have the clarity, the accuracy, the pinpoint sense of where everything belongs, and you're not able to articulate it as such. And people can pick up on that. When you're not prepared, and you're sort of like rambling, you're sort of like using words to cover for your lack of knowledge, we sometimes do that. The kids will, maybe not right away, depends on the age of the child, but they will pick up that we're not prepared and all of that. So this is actually good for us too, because if we go through the process first, which is always a good idea, right? You never really want to assign anything to your students that you haven't tested yourself. And parenthetically, I will mention that research says that it usually takes your students 4 times as long as the teacher to complete any test. So if you have a 40-minute period and you expect to give them a test that will go from the beginning of that period to the end, it better take you 10 minutes or less. Because if it takes you 15 or 20, your students are not going to get it done. This is an aside. Okay? So it's always good practice for you to go ahead and to do that. Any other questions or comments before we move on? Yes?
That's when you just said that stat of 4 times the amount, saying that it's with written answer?
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's not going to be all.
No, I'm saying like a multiple choice test. I can't imagine it's going to take 4 times.
Well, you know what? It actually will, because you clearly know, the answers.
Yeah, well,
they have this with multiple choice is not as easy as we think. In fact, my students used to do worse on multiple choice tests than they did on almost any other test, because a multiple choice is very much a yay or nay type of test, and the odds are against them. The odds are 25%, something like that they'll get it right, and the other 75% that they won't. Now, obviously, they go in with certain knowledge that sort of tips the scale, but it's not like true or false. It's not even like a short answer where I can demonstrate some degree of mastery. With short answer, with essay, I can tell you I know something. Whereas in multiple choice, it's either right or it's just not right. Even if I can argue why I think it's right,
that's in
it's
terms of
wrong.
the quality of the assessment. I'm just saying in terms of how long it will take the student to complete.
I don't know about multiple choice specifically, but my point to you is good test design anyway says not to give them a exclusively multiple choice. Even though the standardized tests do it, kasha analysis, so to speak, but it's not right. You should be using essays, you should be using more opportunity to bring out the information that the students are. Keep in mind, they're completely at your mercy when they take a test. Because whatever you put on the test is what they have to respond to. Whereas if you give an essay, you're giving them more freedom. And if you do an oral test, you're giving them even more freedom. It's not our topic, but it's worth bearing up. There's a hand over here? No, okay. So coming back for a moment to modalities before we move forward, there are 8 intelligences that Gardner and his chevra have identified. There were originally 7. They added naturalist later. I'm not fully clear on why or how that's a genuine independent intelligence. But I will tell you that we definitely think differently from each other, and we also have different ways that we intake information, that we process it. Usually we do it through our ears, oftentimes with our eyes, to a lesser degree with other senses, including our hands, our touch. Okay, that's called kinesthetic. Kinesthetic is moving. So for example, if I get you into a cooperative learning environment where you're talking with one another, you're getting up, you're relocating, you're doing something together, in addition to intrapersonal, which means that we're talking to each other and we're hearing out one another, sort of like chavrusa concept, I'm also moving around and I learn better when I move. You'll have students who need to squeeze something, need to sort of go up and down a little bit, maybe need to pace the back of the room in order to learn more effectively. That's just how they're wired.
It's not part of the learning process, just that they...
It's their way of intaking information most effectively.
What's that to do with the intake information if they're squeezing the ball?
Because it helps, it could be a focus matter for them, that it helps them sort of focus. But again, a lot of it has to do with how we associate information.
Yeah. Martha, we're going to be spending time on Gardner perhaps later tonight, if you all want to stay.
Okay.
And he's in section 4. And so we're going to go
There you
into
go.
some more detail
Okay.
tomorrow.
The point is that as we consider different approaches, this, for example, graphic organizers, does tap into different modalities, and that can be very helpful for some students who don't necessarily do well if all I do is talk. Even if I use the board, it might not be enough for them. Okay? So at this point, I think what I'm going to do, let me just, if I may, for a second. Okay, so I was thinking of including Yereva, but I just don't want to.
I'm very tired of it, Phil.
Yeah, okay. You decide. You could float in and out of conversation if you'd like. I think what we're going to do is to create. I'm going to try this and see how it goes. 4 groups of 3. Is that right? Did I count right? Actually, no. It's not going to work. I need 4. I'm going to have 2 groups of 4 and 2 groups of 3. That's what I think I have. I think I have 14 people in this room. Let me double check here. Yeah, I do. Okay. So sometimes you have to be a little bit flexible. Let me first tell you what we're going to do, and then I'm going to tell you how we're going to do it. Okay? Is anyone here familiar with something called the jigsaw method? You're familiar? To the degree you'd like to share, or?
Doesn't it usually involve breaking class up into different groups and have the students in each particular group help the other students.
Okay, almost everything, and there's a lot of really good stuff that you just said. Excellent, thank you. Okay, jigsaw, as you can imagine, a puzzle. It's got a lot of different pieces. Now, the way that cooperative learning works in its ideal form is that we're working with each other, we're promoting each other's learning, but everybody has a job. Everybody, if I don't have a job, I can hitchhike. If I have really brilliant people in my group, they're going to learn everything, and they're just going to, maybe they'll tell me that kind of thing. So I want to avoid, at all costs, creating that type of environment. I want to give everybody responsibility. So the way that jigsaw would work, let's use an ideal situation. Let's say the other two people who aren't here were here, because I understood we had 16. So if everybody would have been here, then I would have created 4 groups of 4. And every group would have been, in every group would be an A, a B, a C, and a D. Okay? So there's 1A, 2A, 3A, 4A, 1B, 2B, 3B, 4B, etc. Okay? The way that it would start, let's just say for argument's sake, that these 4 gentlemen over here were in a group. And maybe they will be, we'll see. Okay? So you'd be A, B, C, and D. Are you with me so far? This is group number 1. Let's just say this is group number 2. A, B, C, D. So far, so good? Okay, the A's know who they are. Who are the A's? Raise your hand, please, if you're an A. Okay, good, excellent. If you're a B, please raise your hand. Fantastic. We'll let the C's come forth, please. Okay, this is not a reflection on their academic capacity. And D's? Excellent. Okay, now, these gentlemen over here, I'm close, but I don't have 8, I have 6. But we'll figure that out in a second. Okay? Now, probably what I'm going to do, in the interest of making this work, is I'm going to make one of these 3, as well as one of these 3. I can't, well, can I make them a double? I can't do it that way. So I probably would have to go back and figure this out. But the main idea is as follows. Once we're done, and I'm going to figure it out, I think, before I'm done, before I get you actually moving, is that everybody's going to have specific content that I want them to learn. Okay? So in the case of the graphic organizers, the package you're going to get soon, I'm going to assign specific graphic organizers for you to look at. And you're going to look at them in your group. Okay? And there's something you're going to do with it. And then you're going to go back to your original group. So that means that, assuming for the moment that these 4 are together, they're actually not going to be talking to each other now. They're going to be meeting up with other people that they've never seen before because they're on the other side of the room somewhere, and they're going to get acquainted with them. Okay? It's good for interpersonal connection as well. Then they come back. And so if this gentleman over here had an opportunity to learn about a Venn diagram, which is one of the graphic organizers, he becomes the resident expert amongst these 4. Are you with me? So he now brings some real knowledge that only he possesses back to his original group. So the benefits are focused learning. The benefits are expectation, because I expect you to really do your effort and come back knowing something meaningful. And then I have an obligation to teach. And we all know that research says that I do best in terms of my own learning when I have to teach it to somebody else. Right? There are levels of retention, levels of clarity that I achieve, and the greatest one is when I actually have to teach other people. And I can tell you from my own experience in the classroom, I know things best at my fingertips when I've taught it to other people rather than I just read it in a book somewhere, or maybe even watched a video about it or whatever that might be. Because I was actually able to process it, internalize it, make it my own. Okay? That type of thing.
I have to bring Rabbi Gottlieb in.
I'm sorry?
I had to bring in Rabbi Gottlieb.
Is he in our group?
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Are you still in our group?
Nice. Are you here? Great. So Rabbi, you're in. Okay. Okay, so we're going to do it right now. The 4 gentlemen over here. Hi, Shalom Aleichem. A, B, C, D. Remember your letters, please. You're group 1. Okay? Same as we said before, this is group 2. A, B, C, D, group 3. And then Rabbi Gottlieb, you are D. Okay? The rest of you can figure it out. A, B, C. Okay, this is what's going to happen. You're going to get a packet. I'm going to give it up now.
I'm in this group.
I'm sorry? All right, so if you can each take one, please, and then make sure that everybody else at your table gets one as well. Okay, if you could take one and pass, please. And then the same for you, Rabbi, in case you don't have one. This is yours. Now, could you be so kind as to count how many pages there are in the packet? There should be 8 or close to it. Are there 8 pages? You have 9? Okay.
Doubles of one.
Is there?
There's a kid.
The KWLs, there are two of them? Oh, they're different. No, so keep them separate. Okay, so listen carefully, please, because the worst thing you can do, gentlemen, if I can have your attention for a second, really important. You never want to let the inmates out of the asylum, especially if they don't know where they're going, because then you have chaos. Parenthetically, I will mention, I'll use your cup if I may for a moment, because it does have a little bit of water in it, not the perfect metaphor, but close. There's something called a fishbowl method. The fishbowl method is where you model what you want to have everybody doing by having a small group do it first. And the fishbowl concept is like you imagine a fish floating in this bowl and we're all watching it do its thing from the outside. So the fishbowl method might be you bring 4 students from your class the previous year. Where's older people who are more mature and get it, and they could model for your present class what you want that process to look like. And your class could actually be dayanim, and they're sort of they're determining did they do it correctly, not correctly, that kind of. They're really getting into it to watch the people in the proverbial fishbowl do their thing. So it sometimes could be a good, if you think you're doing something that's a little bit unclear, and you're not sure that your students will get it the first time, it can work, and it can work very nicely. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to ignore page 1 for now. It's a very important page, but we're going to ignore it for now. It's not really the type of graphic organizer that normally is part of our conversation. So please turn, you can look past it. Gentlemen who are A's, can I see the A's again, please? I need to see 4 hands, okay. Those 2 are going to look at then, and the one behind it, the cluster word web 1. Are you with me? Can the B's please find KWL and KWS? Those are going to be the 2 that the B's will focus on. C's are going to look at step by step and the timeline. And then the D's, which include our Begali, will do the sense chart and the multiple intelligence lesson planning. What I'm asking you to do is as follows. Listen carefully. You're going to go into the group where I show you. It's going to be, by the way, A, B, C, D. Let's get that again. All the A's are going to come here. The B's are going to go here. The C's will come here, and the D's will come to this table in the front. Okay? You will focus on the 2 graphic organizers that I just assigned to you. You're going to try to come to some understanding of what is it, and how could I apply it. Okay? So in other words, what I'm looking for is a brief description. I'll put it over here just in case you like to see that. I'm looking for a description. Hopefully there's enough information there that tells you about it, or you could look at it and sort of figure it out. That's number 1. And number 2, I'm looking for applications. So you might say to me, I see this as a perfect graphic organizer to explain the machlokes, Rashi, and Tosfos. I see this as a beautiful way by which to teach Jewish history. I see this as a great way by which to teach who knows what. Everybody with me? Okay? So I'm going to ask, now I'm going to check for understanding. Would anyone like to tell me where we are going?
I just know where D is.
I'm sorry?
I just paid attention to where D's going.
Okay, well that's fine. Well, where are we going, gentlemen? Anyone like to volunteer? Please. Okay, so all the A's, the B's, etc. What are we doing when we get there? Yes?
We're going to work on our given ages to develop them to then present later.
Not to fill them up.
Not to fill them up.
Not to fill them up. Let's just make clear. I'm looking for a basic, you can tell it to me orally, what your group thought this is for, as well as application. Where could I use this? Okay, I want to make sure that that's clear. Now, how are we going to sit when we do this? How are we going to sit? How are we going to arrange our chairs when we do this?
Facing each other?
I'm sorry?
Facing each other.
Facing each other, very important. 2 and 2 sounds good to me. So these 2 gentlemen might bring their chairs around, okay, or you'll slot whatever it is, maybe the outer, sort of like Hataras Nadarim, but you know, whatever, you'll figure it out, okay? We're very good in that regard. We have that cultural context, okay? So now I'm only going to give you about 5 minutes in your original focus group, and then I'm going to probably give you about 5 more minutes in your original group, because when you're done, all the A's, B's, C's, and D's go back to their original seat, then they talk to each other. The A's share, the B's share, etc. Okay? Now, obviously, the risk that I'm taking right now is Did I give you enough information that you're not going to come back and say, oh, these are about elephants walking in I don't know what, make up something ridiculous. Hopefully, it's okay. If not, I'll be walking around to try to listen, as well as to provide clarity with any questions that you might have. Any questions for me before we begin? Okay, gentlemen, let's get started. We have 5 minutes. Where you can actually manipulate the graphic organizer by typing content right into it, which might be valuable for you depending on your school. Maybe you're telling me you didn't have computers. Maybe you want to be able to do that, where they can go right into the document and type in information. Okay? All of these things are options. Any questions about what I just said?
It's .com.
It's .com, you check? Okay, super. All right, so it is .com. In regular class, we hope your students wouldn't be able to check, but for tonight, it's okay. Yes?
Just going back to this point for a second.
Yes.
Shabash Kivan al. Right, so I'm just thinking a good time to use this would be, let's say, to review for a test. Basically, they know it already.
Okay.
But this way, they could.
So I want to talk about when in a little bit, because that's an excellent point and it deserves attention. When are we going to use it? But before we talk about when, let's first figure out what. Okay? What are they and how? All right? So, anyone on this one, please? First of all, what is it? And what do you see as its purpose? Please don't give me an application just yet. Let's focus on the name as well as a brief description of what it's used for. Yes?
The Venn diagram is used, you have, you're comparing 2 or more things where they share some characteristics and they differ in some characteristics to organize which ones are similar, which ones are similar, and you can see what are the attributes that are unique to each one.
Good. So give me 2 words that both start with the same letters that capture the essence of what you just said. First 2 letters are the same in both words. Is that what you're going to say? Compare and contrast. Excellent. So I'm going to see how are they similar and also how are they different. Now, you notice, by the way, when you were talking, I made it all the way over here. You know why I did that? You know why. Number 1, because he was playing with his phone, so I needed to develop some proximity.
He does it in shul.
And by the way, you notice the phone is no longer here, I hope. But number 2 is because you were really quiet when you first started, and I thought I was able to hear, but I wasn't sure that everybody was. I certainly didn't think they'd be able to hear you. What did I accomplish by coming over here? Anyone? Yes?
You were able to see if Manal come over there.
Leave him alone for a second. We beat up on him.
No, you're able to see if he's able to hear.
Oh, okay. But what else did I do?
Making him talk louder.
I made him talk louder because subconsciously I speak to the distance of the recipient, right, or the listener. So if the listener is really close, which, by the way, teachers typically are. Most teachers are guilty of the T thing. I don't know exactly what you call it, but it's basically you walk out a little bit, and you go a little bit azay, and a little bit azay, and that is all we do. That's all she wrote. And most teachers sit and don't do any of that, or maybe use the board. And therefore, it would be great for me to walk around the room. I didn't create a great space. In other words, if this were my classroom, I would never have a 4-person table right here because I would have to go around every time, which would be bad for me. And besides, these gentlemen block those. If I like a semicircle, which I happen to prefer personally, you have to know if you can use it. But either way, in doing so, I have proximity, I have movement, and I can hear you better because you've now raised your voice loud enough so that, because you wanted me to hear you, and I'm now further away. And you're not going to stop me and say, well, why are you walking? Usually not. More, you're just going to adjust, which is key. Yes, Rabbi? Get your hand up?
Yeah, I did, because there's actually something I forgot to mention to the class.
Oh,
Over the course last week, you mentioned, which was just to make sure, when you remember we talked about class setup, when I go in sometimes to schools to observe classrooms, one of the observe classes, one of the things I do is I walk around, I get down on student level, and you'd be surprised how many kids go through a year in a classroom, they can't see the board. Or they're at an angle to the board. Or as Rabbi Voff said, they can't hear you so well. Or they can't see you. So you actually triggered that memory that I meant to mention. We talked about classroom setup. When you go into your class before it starts and you get down, you have to get down and that kids see wherever they are. Very often the kids in these rows, especially in some of our buildings where you will have long, narrow rooms, and the education is dictated by the space, not the other way around. So I'm just sorry to interject, but I forgot that you raised that point. Remember to always put yourself in the kid's seat in terms of hearing and seeing and following you and tracking you.
Thank you.
Sorry.
And I would, no, not at all. And I would add that there's nothing wrong with some instruction from the back of the room. There's nothing wrong with going to the back of the room and continuing the conversation. You have what you need in hand, and you make your way to the back and you just continue your lesson from that spot. It changes the dynamic of the class, which is good. It creates a certain degree of healthy tension, a minimal amount of proximity, so that the students in the back corner who thought for the next 3 hours they were completely on their own now actually have to worry about the Rebbe who just showed up in their Dalet Amos and may stick around for a little bit, et cetera, et cetera. Now again, you heard my bias about rows. The problems usually are those kids out in the far-flung corners of the universe, and so you have to deal with that. Sometimes you don't have much of a choice. Sometimes you have more spacious rooms, better furniture, you can adjust it. Sometimes I've been in some yeshivas, in Brooklyn in particular, where they will squeeze many, many students into a relatively small space, and I find it extremely difficult to get around, which makes it hard for me to, in order to get to the kid in the corner, if I'm over here, I have to go all the way to the front of the room, and then go into that aisle, and then go all the way to the back of the room. And that's just a lot of work for me in order to create the dynamic that I wish. Did you have a question?
If you're going to teach in the back of the room, aren't the older kids going to turn around?
Yeah, which is nice.
But it can also cause
Why?
I don't know. The kids
No, usually if you're doing your thing, they will respond the way you want them to. Because they're listening to you much the same way they listen to you when you're in the front of the room. But it does mix it up a little bit for them. Yeah, you do want to avoid, the neck issues and whatnot. You're not going to do it for long, but it does force them to adjust a little bit, which can be healthy. Application on the Venn. Anyone have an example of where the Venn could be valuable? I know you weren't an A, so I'd like to hear from you. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it could be any, very often in any issue you'll have machlokas. So they're not arguing, most of the time they're not going to be arguing black and white. They'll agree on this, they'll agree on that. But this they're going to argue, and that they're going to argue.
Super.
So,
or if you're comparing Yom and Tovim, for example, and you want to see where are they similar, where are they different. I typically find, I don't know why this is, it might just be me, that the comparison space is is just too small. There's oftentimes a lot of common ground, and the middle doesn't really give justice to that. You can sometimes manipulate it with word art or other things if you're knowledgeable in that regard, and make it a little bit wider so you have more room in the middle if you chose to. Okay, moving right along. Anyone on this one, please? Again, I'm looking for a basic, just what is it and what is its purpose? Yes?
It's used to, it's a big topic which has a lot of small details. It's used to make it, to clarify it and to separate the different compartments.
Separate them out so that you can sort of visually see, right? So normally if it was a regular classroom with notes, if the Rebbe did it, great. If not, you would have to kind of do it on your own, where you're creating an outline on the board, right? The outline would have Roman numeral 1, and then would have A, B, C, D, and each one would have then those subpoints, right? So instead of an outline, you now have one of these. The benefit of this would be, obviously for the visual spatial learner, it creates a much easier way of seeing the main ideas, right? You can distill the key points because you see where they're spaced. Your mind can connect to it relatively quickly. And then, of course, you could sort of branch out from there. So, for example, if you're teaching, I don't know how many of you intend to teach general studies, but if you're teaching about the Civil War, and let's say the topic's going to be the causes for the Civil War, all right? So maybe there are 4 causes, or 3 causes, primary identified causes that all the scholars agree to, okay? And each one has subpoints associated with it. This would be an example of where it could be useful. Okay, moving right along, just looking at the clock, want to make sure. I happen to think, personally, that this one over here is of the most powerful graphic organizers out there. And I'll tell you why if you don't tell me. Would anyone like to tell me what this is and its basic purpose? We're all friends. I know you want to answer, and that's great. Yes?
Its purpose, well, it has 2 primary purposes.
Okay.
The first purpose is that it helps, in terms of the teacher, it checks for understanding where
Okay.
what the students know.
Uh-huh.
And the second is that it helps the students develop their thoughts and like what they want to know about a topic, and helps them also reflect back on what they have learned.
Beautiful. So it's actually three in some ways. It's sort of my past, what I already know coming into the conversation, what I hope to learn, right? I'm still here, but I sort of have a vision of where I want to go with this. And then when I'm done, having them loop back to it and filling out. So really, in this case, two of them are completed from the outset. This one is left empty and completed later. Is everybody with me on that one? Okay? Because what I learned, how can I fill that in until I actually learn it? Make sense? Now, you talked about checking for understanding. Okay, that's great. There's another application as well. Besides to checking for what was learned. Yes?
It could be helpful for the teacher to find out what it is that the students want to learn.
Let's stay on the first. We'll stay on the first one for a minute. What I know. Yes, specific on the what I know. Yes.
It could be cement that you mentioned before, that you want to know where they're holding. So how are you going to gear your lesson? You don't teach something they already know.
Incredible. And how often do we just like pretend that that's not relevant? Meaning to say, how often do we go into a lesson or a unit on Hilchos Pesach as if they've never learned it before? They don't even know what Hilchos Pesach means. And we mamish start from the very bare bones. Once upon a time, there was this Hebrew nation. They were in Egypt. No, I'm just kidding. But you know, we literally start as if they know nothing. Or we do Parshas HaShavua, Kilu, they know nothing. And they're getting the same Parsha questions in 4th grade as they got in 2nd grade. And the 8th grade is slightly different, but the same basic idea, because we never bothered to actually determine what they know. And so we don't know how to direct our instruction to make it useful for them. Right? We make certain assumptions, and then we operate with those assumptions all the way through. And who's that hurting? Really everybody, students for sure, but even you. Why waste my time on things you know? Right? So when I went at the beginning of class and sort of did a KWL in some regards by asking you about what you already knew, that allows me to pinpoint my instruction specific to where I think I could be most helpful. Now, when am I doing this? Coming to your question a little bit. In this case, when am I doing this?
First day.
Or top.
Well, if it's the beginning of the year, it's the first day. But let's say it's the 2nd month of the school year. When am I doing this? I heard before a topic. How much before?
Right before.
Right before? Is there a benefit in doing it earlier yet?
Yes.
What would that be?
Prepare your lesson.
To help me prepare my lesson. That's called, by the way, differentiating. Well, differentiating is a different piece of it. But that's where differentiating of content comes in. Because I can't differentiate content, which means, by the way, that I give different content to different students, which is sort of a foreign concept to us. Because we expect everybody to open up the same chumash and teach Perek Aleph, Pasuk Aleph to everybody all at the same time, which oftentimes we need to do. But there are some times where if the Talmidim know some aspects of Hilchos Pesach, and I want to give them the opportunity to go into cooperative learning groups, for example, and learn more that way, I can use prior knowledge to differentiate what different groups are learning based on what they already know. Does that make sense? So why waste their time on reteaching that old information? Now, in order to do that, I need a little lead time. In order to do that, I need some lead time. 1 second, hold your thought for a moment. Yes, and then you were waiting.
It doesn't sound so practical to ask kids to tell you everything they know about Hilchos Pesach, because they probably know a lot.
Okay.
And they probably won't be able to tell you
everything they know.
And they probably also don't have the metacognitive skills to be able to tell you what they know. If you teach them, they can tell you, I know that. But they won't.
They liked metacognitive, by the way. The guys picked up on that. It was multi-syllabic. Yeah, great. Okay, so I agree with you. Maybe we can narrow it down even. And within Hilchos Pesach, we can pick something more specific.
What do you suggest for that? Check for understanding. I think we got to start getting the pretest.
So the pretest is an example. This actually would function. This would function in a way, but though not as focused, as a pretest. But not for the purpose of assessing, as much as giving you feedback about what they know. That's really its purpose.
God is saying something different. He's saying instead of just writing what you know, ask specific questions. And that
no, I understand. Right, 100%. I agree with that. to a degree, you can certainly do a pretest as well. So there are different ways by which this can be valuable. You want to say something?
So focusing on the fact that they might already know it. Also, the teacher might be assuming that they know more than they actually know also.
It might be. That's true. Well said. It goes both ways. And that sometimes, in other words, maybe we think they know something that they really don't. And so we go in there operating with a certain level, for example, or assumption about their vocabulary level or their content, and in reality they're missing that.
One thing we also spoke about is bringing things from latent memory or to working memory, using the process of the pretest that over the course of a class, if you start, it's very, very time consuming. But by giving them a concentrated activity, such as this one, some of that knowledge is they're just going to open up, they're going to open up the latent memory back, and things are going to start
Beautiful.
coming out.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay. And the purpose of the middle column, I think we talked about it, just to be clear. What are the benefits? Why is it not useful for me to simply say what I know and what I learned? What am I adding by putting in this middle column of what I want to know? How is it helpful for the teacher? How is it helpful for the students? Yes?
Gets the students invested in the lesson a little bit more.
Beautiful. Okay? Because I want to learn what I want to learn. You might be familiar with project-based learning, right, or inquiry-based learning, where we create, by the way, that's how I learn personally. I get into a topic, maybe, I write articles and whatnot, so there's something of interest to me. And so I research it, and I'll write about it, and I'll sort of get involved in it. And that's how I internalize it. In most cases in school, the child doesn't have that opportunity because the Rebbe sets the agenda. Again, it's not a topic I want to get into per se, but it's something certainly to keep in mind. Yes? No? Another benefit? Yes?
Even though the Rebbe sets the agenda, but sometimes it can be tweaked based on something that might be bothering the class.
Sure.
Or something.
Sure, which is exactly the other benefit.
Right.
Okay, super. Right? The Rebbe hears that a number of boys are concerned with X, whatever that X might look like. Okay? I wasn't planning to teach X, but now that I see it's on everybody's mind, I have to figure out if I want to approach it and how. Okay? Now, what's the benefit of the what I learned column?
Quantifying outcomes.
Quantifying outcomes, yes?
It also helps the students realize that they did learn something, what they gained.
Sure. It gives them good feeling about what they actually accomplished, which is great. Okay? So it has benefits for really everybody. Now, the next page, very similar. Anyone want to comment on the difference? I didn't speak on applications. I'm assuming you could apply to basically anything, a KWL. So really any topic that's new that you want to learn with them, you could use it ahead of time if you so desire. Do you want to respond to that question?
No,
yeah, go ahead.
The main difference is this is more of a project research type of thing where either before a project or a research paper, when you're heading out, instead of heading out and opening up your book and you might discuss the topic at all. You'll get your information of what you know and what you want to figure out, and figure out where I can find those, and then you'll be able to be more guided.
Super. So column 3 in that case is really a continuation of column 2. Column 2 is what do I want to learn, and now where do I go to get it? So it actually creates a different level of ownership for the students, because normally we just assume that, well, the Rebbe's going to tell me. Okay, he's my singular source. What you're actually doing is you're encouraging the Talmidim to become more independent learners. Minimally to think about how they can go and find out more. Now again, you need to know the age of the child and how likely it is that they can access information, what you make available to them, depends on how much resources you have in your classroom or in the library or other places. But it's all based on the students having to think about, well, now that I have this question, what's next? Other than asking Rebbe for the answer. And that, by the way, is a very powerful life skill. Because you want every Talmud to be able to do something with the question that they have, other than to go to the Rebbe or the Rosh Hashiva each time and say, Rebbe, I don't understand. Right? I can go to the Mefarshim, I can go, whatever that might look like. But at least you're giving that, you're starting the process of having them start to find information on their own. And in my opinion, you're doing them a tremendous service in that regard. Okay, I am looking at the clock, and since there was some side-handed Yakisha references at the beginning of our conversation, I do want to stay on it a little bit. So let's take a look at this one over here. Can anyone tell me, did I skip one? I skipped step by step. Well, let's see, I'm not even going step by step. How incongruent is that? Okay, step by step. Anyone for a brief analysis of what this is? Kishmo Kenu? Yeah? Okay, seems like everybody's tired. All right, yes?
You used to illustrate the different steps involved in the process.
Okay. And so what do you have here? Describe what's on the chart.
You would have the student list whatever materials are involved in the process.
Okay.
Necessary parts. And then the different steps.
Which, by the way, tells you what? If it asks you for materials, what does that sort of tell you is a possible use for this? Because I know most of you were talking academics. Academics as in you were like, let's say, we'll talk about shakla whatever that might look like. But what else could it be?
Experiments.
What's that?
Skills.
Some kind of skill, hands-on project, things like that, where you actually need stuff. You need things, you need ingredients, you need materials to do whatever it is that is going to be done. So step number one would be, I don't know what, go to Home Depot and buy, or maybe you have it already, and so step number one would be, organize the materials on the ground, and then details would be put the nails over here. And obviously, you're not usually doing this kind of thing, but maybe you're building a little sukkah with them, or maybe you're asking them to do something that involves things. Okay? It's good to know that you have a space for that, and they should understand its purpose. Go ahead, please. I'm sorry. Were you just doing it? Okay. And so step number one might be, Kashas Rava, and then you would elaborate in the details what Rava actually asked, and you go through that process. Okay? Anything that has a sequential layout could be beneficial. Yes?
Someone in our group actually had an idea like, let's say, teaching Vayikra, bringing a korban.
I heard about that.
We go through different steps.
Beautiful. Beautiful. I actually, I'll digress for a second because it might be an idea that will be beneficial to you down the road. I was teaching juniors in high school, and the curriculum called for me to teach Vayikra and Bamidbar. Don't ask me why. And so I did what I normally did, which was to identify certain prakim that I felt would be most beneficial to be ma'amik in, and then gave them some type of superficial treatment for much of the other parts of those svarim. And I began with the avoda of Yom Kippur, considering that we started the year really with the Yomim Noraim, I thought it was very germane to that particular time. Now, considering that they had no background in korbanos, and even the psukim are not really that clear, so I actually, and this was a school where this was possible, I created what was called a webquest that went online, and they actually had different roles. And there was you'll forgive me, a fashion designer who was in charge of the Big Day Kahuna. There was a I called him an Akronat or something, who was in charge of the tefillas and the Tilas Yadayim Reglayim. You had a tour guide who walked, and the basic idea was that they had the Beis HaMikdash, third Beis HaMikdash by Shlishi was just rebuilt. No Kohanim know what to do, and so we're going to write up a Avodas Yom Kippur for Dummies manual. That was the goal. It's in the what? My article?
Assessment by Rabbi Naftali.
Oh, nice. Oh, okay, good. Okay, great. You actually saw that one. Oh, beautiful. I forgot about that. Okay, anyway, so you see it clearly, and that's cooperative. But what's nice about it also is that it really creates, those various opportunities, and you see it sequentially. That's where the tour guide, had his role, and he can provide details. Okay, moving along to the next one. I'm going to move to the questions on it simply because of time. Any questions about how this could be used? I think if you're teaching any narrative in Chumash, if you're teaching history, if you're teaching anything where there's a beginning, middle, and end, this could be helpful. And sometimes it's just better to see it this way than it is to see it in numbers laid out on your paper. Okay?
Could you use that also for...
I'm sorry?
Let's say you're teaching something that doesn't involve dates, just this is the question, the more, this is the answers.
So I don't know that I would use this, because this is really meant for plotting. I don't know if I'd use that one, but I probably would use the previous one. more of a sequential. I'm sorry? You could, and you could go back to the cluster one if, let's say, the Gemara has a few different havaminas before, finally arrives at its maskana. I'm going to skip the senses one for now. I'd like to focus on this one, which I think is valuable, and then I want to come back to the first page. This one is valuable because it's really, for those of you who are in the D group, this is really for you as a teacher. You'll notice, by the way, that there are 7 modalities reflected on this page, not 8. Naturalist is not here. And you'll see the URL for this particular one at the bottom of the page. This is not from Houghton Mifflin. Okay? And I would not say that, I sound like Dr. Seuss, I think, that you need to do this in every lesson, that every lesson needs to include an auditory and a visual, spatial, and a logical math. It's not the way that I think we can function effectively, but I do think minimally in every unit, you want to have a few of these. Now there are some that I think belong in every lesson, right? Normally there are those 4 modalities, which is visual and auditory kinesthetic, and then, well, it's really VARC is visual, oral, read, write, and kinesthetic. If you want, by the way, to take your own test, a little bit of a digression, but I think worthwhile. There's a website you can go to. It's called vark.learn.org, and you can actually learn about your own modalities. It only tests you for 4, but you can get a sense of how inclined you are towards a particular orientation. And I think that's very valuable because we tend to teach the way we feel most comfortable. So if I'm very, very auditory, which I am, and I'm also, I think, very linguistic. So if that's my style, then I might be up here spouting off and waxing poetic, whatever I might be doing, I might not be meeting your needs. So minimally, it gives me a sense of my own style. You can also, I don't remember exactly where, on the same website, you can actually access a kids version for younger people. And you may want to give it to your students because they should know how to do it. And they should know some of the things that they can do in order to make sure, because the Rebbe may not be able to do it every time, but the Talmidim oftentimes can compensate if they know. The same way, for example, Lo Elena, if a child has diabetes or other certain conditions, they compensate because they need to, right? Their health dictates that they do that. So if they know about their learning style, they can do so. And by the way, Edutopia, I don't know, I guess it's pronounced Edutopia. I don't know how you pronounce it. Edutopia, maybe. Okay, Edutopia, okay, .org, I believe, also has, and there's actually tests for more modalities. I took it today. I took it earlier today.
I can share with you. I have it written, but you can.
Okay, and then you can self-test.
I can email it to you. Would you
So this one you could print. This one you could print, or you can go onto the computer and you could punch in your answers. It'll generate a response for you. So a question might be, when somebody asks you for directions to the supermarket, you will, A, tell them how to go. B, write it out in words. C, draw a picture. D, take them there. Okay? Clearly, if you know anything about modalities, you start to pick up on which one is which. But you start to see, well, hey, I normally would just make a picture. That tells you something about your own learning style and your own learning preference, which is good to know. Okay? So keeping this in mind, I think, can be very valuable. And I'm sure you're going to learn about it more in this class, but there's, as great as Rabbi Gottlieb is, the amount of time that he has is so limiting. Okay? What you're doing now, you're trying to condense a tremendous amount of content in a very short period of time. I would encourage you on your own to learn more about intelligences and modalities, because it ultimately it'll give you certain verbs, for example. And when you ask students to think in particular ways, to do certain things, you're tapping into specific modalities, which can be helpful. And then you keep like a running tab of these, and you say, well, how often did I give my students an opportunity to quietly sit at their desk and consider something without saying a word, which is something we typically don't do. We're a society that thinks if we don't talk a lot, we're not intelligent, or that we're not doing something meaningful. And we forget that some of the greatest learning that ever happens is with quiet, intrapersonal reflection. That would be in this box over here. And that ties in, I know you learned about Bloom's taxonomy. Some of the higher levels of cognition oftentimes require quiet. Not for everybody, but for some people. They do best when they can just think about it and not be interrupted. And some people need to talk about it. It could be extrovert, introvert, it could be a lot of different things, but it all speaks to the way that different people learn differently.
You know, I'll interject.
Okay.
When I was a new principal, there was a certain teacher that it wasn't clicking. There's certain things, and so I called, guess who, everybody? Who'd I call?
Dr. Foreman.
Robert Foreman. And over the phone, I told him what was going on, and he said to me, he thought, and he said, she hates silence. And he nailed it over the phone. It was so interesting. And it's not something, and the point you're making is so great, because we come from the Chavrusa system, we come from the share system, but if you'll see, and sometimes you may have a Chavrusa and you think like it's not really going, but you may be a reflective thinker, and you may be, exactly once we got to that, I started working with the class and observing your class, it was just, after an hour in there, you were just exhausted, because she was just, it was just, she couldn't stop. And that was, I love that you mentioned, because that was the first time that I really confronted that and came face to face with it, and how her personality and her style was really playing out in the classroom. She was a great teacher, well-meaning, but it was to the detriment of her students.
Beautiful. What's musical mean? Musical means, well, it means a couple of things. I'm actually just wrote an article about it today. Musical has two applications. Number one, that you have those inclinations on your own. We oftentimes, this is a brief soapbox, we oftentimes think that we're all, imagine education is sort of like an assembly line. And we're kind of like moving everybody through the same way. We're trying to create, more or less that everybody should follow a specific pathway. And we oftentimes don't put enough attention to natural inclinations and interests. And so in the case of musical, part of it might just be that I enjoy it and I have talent. In some cases, it's I learn best when there's music as part of my learning paradigm. So for example, there's soft music playing in the background. When I used to teach Jewish history, one time I would teach about the Klal Yisrael, Galus Yechanya, and then Galus Sidkiyahu. And somewhere in that point, we have Al Naros Bavel. So I would show them a picture, I would have them read the words, and then I would play. There was a group of three brothers that used to sing Kol Achai. I forget, it was you might be familiar with their song, but they have a song, Al Naros Bavel, and I thought it really captured it very well.
Perform it.
It's actually somewhere in between, I think, because it's around mine. So anyway, the point is that it helped them, I think, it captured the mood. And I'll tell, what's that?
Practically, it's not going to be applicable to.
Oh, sure it is. It's also great, by the way, for memory. Anything you can put to song is going to do wonders for the students' retention.
They do it in all the codes.
Yeah, they need to do it, and they need to do it. Well, they do it with parshias, and they do it with certain things. I used to teach the 5 zugos, which is Yossi ben Yoezer and Yossi ben Yochanan and Yeshua ben Gamla, Anita Harabeli, Bechulei, and Yeshua ben Prachia, excuse me. And those are hard names, and there's 5 sets. It gets easier when you get to Shemaim, Naftali, Hillel, and Shammai at the end. But I knew that my students really struggled with it, because who wouldn't? Just lists of names. And I wanted them to remember them, the lists between Shimon HaTzadik and Tignish ben Yisachel, and then eventually to Beis Hillel Beis Shammai. So I put it to Karl Bach St. Kilokamen. It works beautifully. And I would have students not only were singing with me as sophomores, but they would, if they were meandering down the hallway as juniors or seniors, and they heard the song coming out of my class, they'd walk right in, and they'd maybe miss a beat here or there, but they basically got it years later. I can promise you, if I taught it as a list, it would have been, talking about mind dump earlier today, that would have been the classic mind dump. Put the 5 names on the 10 names on the paper, never to be remembered again. And if they would have encountered those names in Pirkei Avos 5 years down the road, it'd be ki'ilu they never learned it before. So if you put it to song, it's part of the way we remember, part of the way we process, and ultimately part of the way we engage. And it can be very helpful. Yes?
In the school, that's why they teach tefillah and...
Sure. Sure, that's why we know all the words of benching. That's the only reason we know all the words of benching. Okay. Now, the first page, which is the last thing we're going to discuss, is in many ways very, very important, but just a little bit different. It also is a graphic organizer because it's a picture. It helps to organize. The difference is that you're filling it out as the class goes, and you're teaching your students from the outset that there are key ideas, supportive detail, and then at the bottom you have the ability to summarize. Now, oftentimes children, when they listen to a class, especially if the Rebbe doesn't use the board or doesn't use it so effectively, they don't really know what to write down, or they'll write down everything. And when they go back to the notes later, it's sort of like this big mishmash. Now, you might not have that experience because you might have had great, one of the reasons probably you're interested in going, usually people go into chinuch, I don't know if you got into this, probably for one of two reasons. Either because they just have a natural inclination, did very, very well in school, and they felt very successful, very competent, or perhaps they had just such a miserable experience that they want to go ahead and rectify, all the years of who knows what that they had to endure. But I'm guessing you fit more into the former category than the latter. And if that's the case, you might think instinctively that, of course, everybody knows how to write notes. It's sort of like when I think about who's a great head coach or manager in professional sports. It's usually not the all-star. Now, some of it might just be because the all-star made so much money they don't need to be doing this. Maybe. But it's oftentimes because the all-star, it got so easy, it was so natural, so intuitive, whatever that might look like, that just wasn't their thing that they're able to necessarily teach it foundationally to those who need that level of support. This is just my own theory. I've never, confirmed it in any way, shape, or form. That's for, I guess, the next doctorate, one step at a time. But this is something that I think your students need to learn, whatever the grade is that you're teaching. Now, if they're really young, they're probably not going to be able to do this. And so you're going to have to create a much easier version of whatever note taking you even want them to take. Okay? But certainly as you get into the upper part of elementary school, into middle school and beyond, you want your students to be able to distill key ideas in what you're sharing. And so you need to train them. And what I would encourage you to do is perhaps provide them with a 5-minute lecture and ask them beforehand to identify key ideas and put them over here, etc., and see what they do.
Yep. What exactly are you writing down?
So here would be, the Q column would be the main concepts, like the big picture items. And then next to it are the specific details that attach to it. So for example, I don't know if you're familiar with PowerPoint, but you may be familiar with the fact that within PowerPoint, you have the ability to print in different ways. So you could print 1 slide per page, you could print 2, you could print 3, you could print 4, I think up to 9. You familiar with that? Okay. Now, the one, and the only one, and I'm not sure why, but that's the way I designed it. The only way that you can print PowerPoint with adjacent lines is if you print 3 slides per page. Have you ever seen that? 1, 2, 3, and then lines printed adjacent to it. So what I started to do when I taught Jewish history, because it was so much information, and it was just a painstaking process. I was writing the whole period. They were copying the whole period. There was no time for any engagement. It was taxing. It was boring. I didn't like it. I started to, first I converted to transparencies. I'm dating myself a little bit here. And then I went to PowerPoint. And what I did was, I took the main ideas from my outlines. I put them into the slide. I added some visuals for effect, whatever that might be. And then I printed lines to the side, and I asked them to fill in the details adjacent to the slide that were more specific. And this way, they didn't have to write everything, but I gave them the main idea, and then I was asking them to fill in the rest. Okay? So there are different approaches you can utilize for that purpose. I think the main thing in this last point that I want to make is that don't assume. The same way we talked earlier about don't assume that just because you say it, they learned it. Don't assume that just because you said it, they got it and can now think about the processes involved. I've got to discern what he's saying. I've got to get it clear. And I've got to decide where it goes. And I've got to decide where it goes where I don't even know what's coming next. That's a lot to ask of a student. And maybe it's a skill we develop over time. But remember, you're well into your learning process. They're at the very beginning. And so you need to give them every competitive advantage you can to help them plot information properly. This isn't the only way. This is what's called the Cornell note-taking method. It was developed by researchers at, you'll never guess, Cornell University, okay? And it is seen as one way, it's certainly not the only way, but one very good way by which you can help your Talmidim organize information in a manner which is digestible. They can visually spot, these are the main ideas, here are the supportive details, and then at the bottom, you have sort of a wrap-up summary, kind of like the KWL, what did I learn? And this way it puts some closure to the conversation.
Yes. These are just tips for studying, not part of this.
Yeah, this is for you. This is not for them. In other words, this is for the person who's looking to use it, what would go in here, etc. And they actually give you...
go in there. I mean, the record questions we said, like review, just studying methodology, that's not part of the...
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I didn't look at it as closely. Okay, yeah. Right, that would be, it might very well be then. Hold on a second. Actually, I have to read this one to see exactly what's in here. If you see at the bottom, it's really more for students studying in college. So it's probably something you have to adapt to your own environment. But the breakdown is as I described before. The main things here is you want to express what is this lesson about. Okay, what are the big ideas in this lesson? Here are the key components associated with it, what we call the details. Obviously keeping them as organized as you can. And in the bottom would be a summary of what the lesson was about. The key points that you want them to take away when you're done. Okay, any final questions? Yes?
It's similar in a way to the step-by-step chart, except it's not.
In some ways, though the step-by-step doesn't give space for
the main ideas and details.
Well, I don't know if the step-by-step separates them as main ideas or just as steps. In other words, you don't see in the 5 steps here that there's a sense of prioritization. It's more sequential.
There is, because it's separating out the details. So.
Well, yeah, I agree with that. But keep in mind, this is really more for a process. This is more for a lecture. This is more like I'm sharing information. Here, I'm describing what are the actual steps in.
The idea that we're separating the details.
Got it. Thank you. Yes.
What was the application for the jigsaw method?
What was the application?
What application? What would be an application to use?
Where could you use it?
In a classroom.
Any place where you want your students to learn different things. So, for example, I'll use a general studies example for simplicity. You want to teach about the upcoming election, and you want to teach about 4 different candidates or 8 different candidates in that election. So you're going to jigsaw out the group, and you're going to give them different information about different candidates, and then they're going to come back and teach about their candidate. Or maybe you're going to teach about the different months of the year, the Jewish calendar, and what are some key things from those months. So this one has Tishrei, and this one has Elul, whatever it is, and then they become the resident experts in their respective area. I have used it for Psukim as well. It can be a little bit more challenging because often with narrative, it's sequential, and so it's hard for me to learn Pasuk Dalet if I never learned Pasuk Aleph. That could be a challenge. But if you're teaching, for example, Parshas Kedoshim, where every pasuk is its own world, its own mitzvah, its own concept, that would be a great place where you could teach jigsaw, or you could use that. As long as you give them enough support. You have to make sure that I give them the vocabulary, that I give them whatever they need to be able to learn it. That's a challenge. But if you create that level of independence amongst your Talmidim, then they're going to really like that, because then they're not dependent on you. Yes?
At some point in this Cornell system there, and it basically sounds like where you're describing empowering students to take notes and to use those notes to internalize the knowledge and then get on track, reflect, use it for studying, develop testing questions. Is that something that you ever do it obviously at a higher level in school like that?
Sure.
And at a lower level, I guess, with elementary school, to have kids help their own graphic organizers and not give them, sort of prototype or whatever it is, just have them decide how they can use this information best.
How they could use it, or how they could record it.
Right, how they could organize it for themselves.
So organizing, I think with students in most cases, choice is a good thing, but I think if you don't give them a structure, it's going to be harder for them. They do well when they have sort of a model by which to follow. Otherwise, again, if the teacher's writing it in an outline on the board, they can copy the outline. That might not be their style, but it works for them usually. I had teachers that way, and we were able to copy that information. But if you want them to own it, then giving them something where there's a little bit of room for them to do their style can be beneficial, but you still keep them from veering too far. keep them focused on the main idea, the details, etc.
Even high school, even?
I would argue in high school in many cases even more because there's so much more information that they have to hold on to. Now, I didn't answer your question from the beginning about when, right? We did a little bit. We talked about checking for understanding. KWO we talked about a little bit also as a way of differentiating content and trying to get a sense of what they know. The one thing, I don't know if I mentioned explicitly, but certainly was implicit in a lot of what we were saying, is a formative assessment. A formative assessment, have you discussed it as a term?
Let's try checking for understanding. Have we discussed the term formative assessment?
You familiar with it? Yes, you remember? Okay.
Yes.
Anyone?
Danny Cohen, yeah.
Yeah.
It's something that you could then see where the class is holding at that point to then decide they know it or they need to learn a little better.
Excellent. Okay, so it's assessment as you go. And it's assessment for learning rather than assessment of learning. Right? What we call a summative test, which is maybe not the right term because summative really means the end of your final usually. But that end of unit test tends to be the almighty high stakes test. Right? That's assessment of learning. Did they learn it? Hopefully, that test should really be perfunctory and sort of ceremonious because you have been testing all the way through. You should know, if you're, forgive me, but if you're any good, you will know by the time they sit down with that test, within one grade range, what they're going to get. 99 times out of 100, I would say you should know that. If you don't, that means you haven't been paying attention the entire time you've been teaching, which is shame on you. I don't mean you personally. But the point is that we need to be assessing as we go. Otherwise, we might be, cruising right along at 70 miles an hour, and we forgot that the passenger never got into the car, right? And we're just moving right along. We lost them on day one or day two. They never got the core concepts, and now we're continuing. We're going into the achrayim and whatever. We keep plowing along, and they never got the core sugya. So you need that formative assessment piece, and Graphic Organizer is a way by which to do that. Certainly not the only way, but one really powerful way. It's good for the students because they can see it for themselves. They can see where their gaps are. They know if they didn't fill in a box, something's not right. So they need to get that information, either from you or from one of their colleagues, one of their peers, I should say. And you get that feedback because you can collect them and you can look at them and you can see. And this way you have ongoing sense of how are you doing and how are they doing, keeping in mind that the process is ultimately for their benefit and it's not about the teaching, it's ultimately about the learning.